Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is wrap up the second chapter in our textbook. And in doing so, kind of wrap up our introduction to symbolic contractionism. So, today, what we'll do is start with our recap, and then we'll get into different perspectives, different kind of sociological theories that sometimes are tied in with symbolic contractionism. So, last class, we looked at kind of methodological approaches, theoretical approaches when it comes to symbolic contractionism. Basically, say when it comes to method, when it comes to collecting information, basically you see disproportionately people using qualitative methods. So again, we talked about different methods such as participant observation, such as ethnography, content analysis. So the qualitative approach that we see within symbolic contractionism is felt to be best suited to find true meaning. So rather than having to kind of guess what somebody means, you tell them to explain their thoughts. You tell them to tell you what they really mean when they're saying something, and that's best captured through qualitative research rather than more quantitative research, where you maybe collect surveys, but those surveys are not verbal information, but rather kind of written information that's coded and crunched into numbers. And maybe you get a large data collection base because you can quickly get a bunch of different surveys finished, and you get a lot of information as a result. But the downside is sometimes you really don't know what's going on in terms of real meaning. When you interview somebody, when you observe them, you're more likely to find out exactly kind of what's going on in terms of what's being meant. But the downside to the qualitative research is often it does take a long period of time compared to kind of the quick and dirty survey methods. So when it comes to theoretical approaches, you again disproportionately see symbolic interactionists use a form of grounded theory. And grounded theory is where you let the kind of ideas emerge from the ground up, rather than using a traditional classical or traditional theory, such as Marxism or Durkheimian theory, to kind of guide your research. You kind of let the research information kind of guide itself. And then over time, you find different patterns, you find different themes. And with that, again, the theory itself becomes bubbling up from the surface, and you can kind of use that kind of towards the end of your research more so than at the beginning. And again, like the qualitative method in general, the grounded theory is seen to be a better fit to find true meaning, because you're less likely to impose your own meaning or somebody else's meaning onto it when you use a more traditional theoretical lens to guide your research from the beginning. So now what we're going to get into are some related perspectives. And so some, I would argue, are more related to symbolic interactionism than others. But nevertheless, you can see some of these overlap in terms of some principles, some different kind of ways of thinking, directly, indirectly tying back into symbolic interactionism. So, of these related perspectives, the one most related to symbolic interactionism is dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is closely related to Erving Goffman's theory. And Goffman talked about basically, in a Shakespearean manner, that, we're all actors, all on a stage, and we all have our different parts that we play, and we all have different scripts that come with parts. And so, Goffman, he had some training, had some work experience in the theater, and so that's where he picked up a lot of this. He kind of noticed where actors were basically following scripts, playing out their parts, and he says we can generalize that to people as a whole. When I step into my professor role, there's a certain script that comes with it, and that script kind of dictates what I wear, how I speak, how I do things, compared to if I enter a different role, such as a husband, I'll dress differently, I'll talk differently, or act differently. And so basically, and that's kind of the simplified version of this. We're all kind of actors on stages, and we play out our parts depending on the part that we're playing. You act differently when you're playing the role of the student, for example, compared to when you're playing the role of a partner, a sister, a brother, so on and so on. And so we try to, according to Goffman, according to other people who follow this perspective, we try to manage the impression of us in the minds of other people. So we try to, we want people to think that we're a serious student. So, we pay attention in class, we nod our heads. And we do that intentionally to try to get the professor to think that, we're engaged. And maybe you're off in la la land, not paying attention. At least you want to give off the appearance, at least you want to give off the impression that you are taking this seriously. And so he says basically, people do this in their parts. They try to create an impression in the mind of other people and how that other people will see them. So I think an easy example of this would be if you ever waited tables. Often you're kind of giving off this performance, and maybe you really don't care if they like the food, or you really don't care, about them in general. But you want to create the impression that you do care, because that creates a smoother experience, and that'll help maybe with tips later on. So exchange theory is another perspective. Again, you can see some overlap, but it's not too tightly connected to symbolic interactionism. So exchange theory basically says that we all try to maximize personal satisfaction. So when we enter relationships, sometimes it's a short term, sometimes it's more long term, a short con versus a long con. But nevertheless, basically you're trying to maximize our satisfaction. So we interact with people and try to, get the most out of that interaction and get the most out of that benefit in terms of, what's important to us, our personal interest. And here, basically, they believe that people are rational beings, that, we always kind of calculate things very strategically in terms of trying to maximize our interest. And that's different compared to some other perspectives that we'll talk about in a second. But going back to Goffman, Goffman believed that we're insincere people. So if I had to say people are, for Goffman, he basically says, we're insincere. Often, we're laughing not because we actually think something's funny, but we laugh just because it's kind of the nice thing to do. We ask people, how they're doing. And again, sometimes we really don't care how they're doing, but it's just kind of something you do. So sometimes we can't be sincere beings, but often Goffman says we're insincere beings. Kind of what we do and why we do it is more about kind of just making things smooth, making things happen without too much, tension emerging. And so that's why we laugh at jokes we don't think are funny. And that's why, when we feel bad, we'll tell people that we feel okay. And so it just makes it less awkward. And so here Goffman says you may be insincere, but actually we're insincere people because we just want to be kind of kind and keep situations going as smoothly as possible. I'll jump forward to two more perspectives. We kind of collapse cognitive sociology with social cognition. And again, this is somewhat related, but not closely tied into symbolic interactionism. Social cognition kind of gets down even deeper into the mind, deeper than symbolic interactionism often goes. We start to look at different mental structures, how those structures are created, and how those structures kind of guide both what we see, input, and kind of what we do in terms of output. And these kind of thought structures are called schemas, and schemas are created through socialization. And again, they kind of influence how we interpret the world, but they also influence kind of how we act towards that world at the same time. And here they believe people are irrational beings. So kind of overlaps a little bit with kind of Freudian theory that people are irrational, but different than Freud's theory. Here, people are conscious and aware of what we're doing, compared to Freud says we're irrational and very unaware, very unconscious in terms of why we do things and what we're doing. So we're irrational beings kind of compared to the exchange theory, because, what we often do is not for our best benefit. We do things all the time and that, it's not because it's, maximizing any interest of ours. We help other people out because we want to help people rather than, we want to get more out of it. Or just sometimes we do stupid things. And it's just, we're not thinking all the time, we're not rational. So that kind of ties into cognition and cognitive soc, and that makes it different a lot from the exchange theory. And so finally, the ethnomethodology looks at basically how everybody has their own personal subjective reality. And this ties into symbolic contractionism a lot, kind of an overlapping principle. And here they specifically kind of look at how shared meanings are just kind of assumed a lot. Like we all assume like we're on the same page. So again, if I ask somebody, oh, did you like, the food that you ate? Somebody may say, yeah, I liked it. And somebody else may say, yeah, I liked it too. But the responses, their meanings, they attach to that eating experience, although they both answered it in the same way. Yeah, I liked it. Here we look at how often the meanings are different. And, and the same thing, if somebody asks you how you're feeling, you say, oh, I feel good, I feel fine. For some people, that could be very literal in terms of I feel good. And other times when somebody says they feel good, there's kind of in the middle somewhere. And so again, they want to look at how we think we share meanings, and that belief that we share meanings actually helps social life kind of go and operate smoothly and functionally. But if you really break it down to the nitty gritty, often we don't share the same meanings at all. But nevertheless, social life does evolve sometimes smoothly without too many hiccups. But sometimes there can be a hiccup when you do assume that you share a meaning and actually you don't. And just a quick example of this, my junior year in college, I studied in Australia and actually had a friend. We shared interest in music, and she's Australian, and we met through the internet. And nevertheless, one time she was visiting Sydney, and we were going to go out to go see a show that night, but also we were going to go out and hang out before. And she said, do you want to go get some tea? And I said, sure, we'll go out before we go to the show and, get tea. And so she came to, my apartment, and she says, okay, so where do you want to go eat? And I was like, oh, I just ate. What are you talking about? She's like, oh, I thought you wanted to have tea. I thought tea was, again, kind of literal, that you're going to go drink something like tea or coffee or whatever. But for her, tea was an entire meal. So again, when we kind of are using different meanings, sometimes you do have those hiccups. You do have a little bit of social dysfunction, but for the most part, although the meanings we share aren't exactly the same, sometimes they're close enough that everything can go smoothly. So here, another thing with this perspective, it ties into, we can highlight these kind of social rules, these kind of rules of the game that we tend to follow. We can highlight those norms often when we break them. So it talks about some of those shows that you kind of mess around with social norms, TV shows and stuff that pull pranks on people. And, when you kind of break the norms, not only are you kind of pranking somebody, making people uncomfortable, but when you break those norms, you highlight the norms to begin with and kind of how important they are in terms of creating a functional social world. So finally, we can look at some emerging spins. So basically, kind of within symbolic interactionism, a kind of different focus, a different perspective, kind of a secondary kind of guiding principle in addition to those principles of symbolic interactionism. So one you often see is feminism. And here they're looking at different meanings and how the meanings help produce gender as a whole, how the meanings help produce inequalities between the sexes. And, you see this a lot in terms of people believe that we perform gender. We learn what gender is. You're not born with it, and you give the proper performance of it. So it ties back to kind of Goffman and that dramaturgy perspective that we talked about. So we create gender, and we kind of use the meanings to guide our behaviors. and those same meanings that we're performing can ultimately contribute to inequalities emerging between the sexes. Conflict theory, we can look at concentrated on inequalities as well, but inequalities, not only in terms of men and women, or even kind of among men or among women as well, but inequalities in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of age, and it's in terms of kind of all aspects of life. And so some people did say that Goffman was kind of a conflict theorist within kind of that structured social psychology, because often he kind of focused on people who were marginalized and how that marginalization was based upon different meanings of what is normal, what is deviant. So specifically, if you have read the book Stigma, he really gets into that. So finally, we can look at postmodernism kind of being used. And here, basically, we're looking at how we live in a new historical period. So according to kind of postmodern theories, we have left modernity and we've entered a new historical period called postmodernity. And within this period, we've had major social changes, new forms of technology, wireless technology, airplane transportation. And, with these new forms of technology, life has changed dramatically. How we live it, how we experience it compared to modernity, where you didn't have the wireless technology. You kind of, get in airplanes and fly one place to another. And life is this kind of experienced differently. A new form of capitalism too. So modernity is more of a production-based capitalism based on manufacturing, producing things. In post-modernity, capitalism is based upon consumption, consuming things really drives the economy today rather than making things. So, with these historical changes that shape our lives today, we have new meanings that really come to the forefront. And those new meanings start to kind of reshape how we experience life. So an example would be in modernity, people self-identified more so with their work. So you were, in terms of your both personal and social identities, you were the job that you worked. People saw you through your job, and you saw yourself through that same lens. But now today, for various reasons, one being that we've changed jobs so often compared to the past, where typically you'd work the same job for a long period of time. But because we're in that consumer-driven capitalism, we identify ourselves, we identify others more based upon consumption practices than their work. So in post-modernity, consumption's the big part of the culture, and we use consumption to self-identify and to identify other people as well. And again, that kind of a shift in terms of meanings and how we use meanings from one history, modernity, to another, post-modernity. So that's all I wanted to kind of do today. Really wrap up that second part of the chapter, wrap up our introduction to symbolic interactionism. And what we'll do next for our class is do a review. And specifically, I'll organize that class review primarily to focus on the exam that we're going to have. So if you make sure to go through the review, because I'll really focus on how what I'm asking you to do in the exam, how to approach it, how to really understand what I am asking you to do. So we'll leave that there. As always, please let me know if you have any questions.